Okay, let's look at some evidence for the Bible. I want to look at one of the most difficult to prove stories, and one that I think the skeptics have been making fun of for centuries. You could try to prove a lot of different stories in the Bible, but why not go for the hardest one, right? And if you talk about the most magnificent story in the Bible, the one that would probably be considered just a complete fantasy, I don't think that you could get much larger than life than the story of the Exodus, right? Here you have a story where, according to the Bible, a nation of slaves in the most dominant country in the world empire of the time, Egypt, according to the story, God comes down and takes this nation of slaves, pulls them out of the empire of the world. I mean, that, Egypt was like the United States in those days, the dominant world empire. Can you imagine if a nation of slaves was just pulled out of the United States? So he takes that nation of slaves, takes them out of Egypt, flattens the country of Egypt for their oppression, takes these slaves, and marches them through the ocean, through the Red Sea, into the Promised Land. Now, the skeptics hear that and they say, this is just ridiculous, right? I mean, what kind of a made-up story to make the Hebrews, have some national pride or whatever, But let's look at this story actually, and let's see if we can find some evidence. I'm going to try and show you today that there actually is evidence for the Exodus and for the Red Sea crossing. And I think if you can show this story, then the rest of the stories of the Bible become a lot more believable. Now, the Egyptians, you can imagine, the Egyptians are the world empire of their time. They are not going to just record in their records that they were destroyed by this slave nation's God, and everything that, their religion and their society and their ruling class, the legitimacy of their ruling class, everything that it was based on was all a lie. They're not going to record that in the hieroglyphs. And so you aren't going to find a confession, so to speak, in the Egyptian hieroglyphs just stating that the Exodus happened. If you can imagine, the ruling class in Egypt at that time dominated society. They were in control of the religion. They were in control of the economy. They were in control of the political system, and they had this power over the masses, and they based their legitimacy as the rulers on the religion of Egypt. And so for them to say, hey, this God of that slave nation, the Hebrews, by the way, he's actually stronger than all our gods. Actually, our gods are just made up. We made up this whole thing about having all these different gods, and we made all that up so that we could rule you guys. And guess what? As you can see, we were lying, because all of our gods have failed next to the God of the Hebrews. So we were lying to you guys. So let's just admit that now. No. You're not going to find that in the hieroglyphs. They're not going to admit that. Why? Because they would be admitting that they had lied to all the people. Who are the people going to turn on? There will be a revolution. They're going to overthrow the leaders. The leaders aren't going to admit that. So what they're going to try and do is cover the story up the best they can. Piece back the nation together the best they can. And you may say, well, why wouldn't they just admit? How could you be so in denial of reality? Well, friends, self-serving interests are very powerful. If you think that your options are, well, I could tell the truth and the people will kill us and we could lose our power, or we could just lie and maybe try and regain some, save face a little bit and try and piece the nation back together, you could see how people who are used to being in power would want to keep hold of their power. And so you don't find evidence for the Exodus in the hieroglyphs. So we're going to have to play Sherlock Holmes, so to speak, and look through the evidence and look a little deeper. And you'll see that the cover-up of the Exodus actually gives even more evidence that it happened. All right, so first of all, the story of the Exodus, biblical archaeology, the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing. That's what we're going to look at. All right, so here we have a picture of the cover of Time magazine. It says Secrets of the Lost Tomb. And this next slide here, you see a picture of these Egyptian pharaohs, and if you can tell from the picture, and we'll look at more, there's a small figure about knee-high in front of the pharaohs. Here, we'll look at another one. You can see how big these statues are because there's some people on the left side there. So these are massive statues. Here's another one. You see the pharaoh there, and you see that small figure in between his legs? That's his wife. The pharaohs were indeed larger than life in the eyes of the people. They portrayed themselves that way, and they portrayed themselves as very much larger than their wives. It was very much a male-dominated society, and these reliefs here that I'm showing you are from the time of Ramesses. Here's another one of the time of Ramesses, and you can see the women are, they're barely past ankle high. Now, why am I showing you this? Ramesses is often portrayed in the popular media as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. You watch, for example, the popular Disney film, Prince of Egypt, and who will they say the Pharaoh of the Exodus was? Ramesses. Now, why do they say Ramesses? I do believe this is part of the cover-up. When you point to Ramesses, you're pointing to a time when pharaohs were larger than life, when the society of Egypt was stable, where the control of the pharaoh, was dominant, and Egypt was stable, and nothing like what is described in the Bible took place in the time of Ramesses. I mean, the Bible story is such that Egypt is flattened by 10 plagues. The Pharaoh dies in the Red Sea, and the religion of Egypt is destroyed. The succession of the pharaohs is destroyed by the killing of the firstborn, and so all of Egypt is just basically flattened. That didn't happen in the time of Ramesses, and I think by the popular press pointing and saying, hey, it was Ramesses, that was the time, then you go back and you look at the history of Ramesses and you say nothing like that happened, so the story of the Exodus must be fake, right? Well, according to the Bible chronology, it could not have been Ramesses. So here's what we're going to look at. Here we're going to look at when the according to the Bible, this actually did take place. What was the time period? If it wasn't Ramesses, which pharaoh was it? So Moses. Many of us have heard of Moses, the great leader of the children of Israel out of the Exodus, and the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible, often called in Hebrew the Torah. Moses was probably called Happy Moses by the Egyptians. The word Moses means to take out of, and Hapi is a reference to the Nile god, and so the Egyptians probably called him Hapi Moses as a reference to the fact that he was taken out of the river, out of the Nile. But in the Bible, they left out the river god reference, because the Bible doesn't teach pantheism, and so the name is just Moses. He was born in 1530 BC. He fled when he was about 40 years old. He fled Egypt in 1490 after he had killed an Egyptian. He was trying to defend the Egyptian from, beating a slave, one of the Hebrew slaves. And Moses had a bit of a revolutionary mindset, and so he defended this slave and killed an Egyptian in the process, and had to flee for his life into the desert. And he stayed there for about 40 years and returned 40 years later. And the Exodus took place on the 17th of March, 1450. Now we have exact dates for that. And the reason we do is because archaeology tells you exactly when the reign of Solomon is. We don't have to guess about that. We know when Solomon reigned. And Solomon gives the exact year from his reign to when the Exodus took place. And so we have perfect dates for that, and this is a very scholarly date that it's accepted in many Bible commentaries all over the world 1450 BC was the time of the Exodus. Okay? Now, here's where it gets interesting. There was a pharaoh by the name of Thutmose III, and according to his scribe, his own biographer, Amenab, this pharaoh died on the 17th of March, 1450. Now, you could say that's, maybe an interesting coincidence. Okay, let's keep looking. And am I making this date of 1450 up? No. Here is a picture of the tomb of that pharaoh, Thutmose III, and this is not. This is right at the entrance of the tomb. This is, the official sign in front of his tomb, put up by the Egyptologists there, and they know what they're talking about. And he says the great conqueror who ruled Egypt from 1504 to 1450 BC. So I'm not making this up. He actually did die on that date, and that actually is the date that Solomon says, or that is recorded in the Bible as the date, basing it on the reign of Solomon. Okay. So Thutmose III died March 17th, 1450. Now, we're going to look a little bit at the 18th dynasty to see, the circumstances around the Exodus, so we can piece this together. The 18th dynasty, we had several pharaohs. One was Ahmose. The name means the moon is born. He reigned from 1570 to 1553 BC. You don't have to memorize these dates. Amenhotep I, the name means Amun is pleased. Amenhotep, Amun is pleased. He reigned from 1553 to 1532 BC. Remember, in BC we count down. We count backwards. And then there was Thutmose I. He was the father of Hatshepsut, and he reigned from 1532 to 1508 BC. And then there was Thutmose II, who reigned from 1508 to 1504, and he was the husband of Hatshepsut. And so the husband of Pharaoh's daughter became Pharaoh, Thutmose II. Now, Hatshepsut, according to the records, could not have children. And she was, as we look at the chronology, she fits as the woman who took Moses out of the Nile and adopted him. And it makes sense because she could not have kids. So she finds this boy in the river and she says, I'll adopt him. And you have to remember, for the wife of Pharaoh, it's very important for her to have a kid. There needs to be someone to take over the throne. But she couldn't have a son of her own, and so she adopts Moses. And apparently Thutmose II thought this wasn't good enough. And so he goes and he has an illegitimate son with another woman. And this son's name is, as you might have guessed, Thutmose III. Now, when Thutmose II, the father, when he dies, he, actually, backtrack just a little bit. Thutmose III, since he was an illegitimate son, he was not raised in the court, in the court of the Pharaoh. He was raised by the priesthood of Amun. And Amun was this Egyptian goat god. And so this young man, Thutmose III, was raised by the priest, and he was a dedicated and ardent follower of Amun, and very versed in the Egyptian religion. Those of you who know anything about the occult or about the New Age may recognize Thutmose III as the principal author of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and which is still a very important book in the occult world today. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is kind of, in a way, it's kind of considered like the occult Bible. And so this is very interesting, where you have the principal writer of the occult Bible, Thutmose III, versus the writer of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Moses. And they're kind of, rivals in this story here. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So Hatshepsut, the woman who adopted Moses, and her stepson, actually became, Tutmosis III actually became co-rulers after Tutmosis II died. And they're co-rulers, and you can imagine Tutmosis III is wondering, well, why can't I be Pharaoh by myself? And this was not an unheard of thing to have co-rulers in Egypt. It did happen somewhat commonly, but he is the son of Pharaoh, and how come he doesn't just get to rule by himself? And it might have been because Hatshepsut was older. It might have been because she already was somewhat in the reins of power. But for whatever reason, the hierarchy had both of them as co-rulers, and so it started out with somewhat of a balance of power. But you'll see in the record that Tutmosis III slowly starts taking over, and this young man is very much power hungry. And here's a relief. Here's a picture of Hatshepsut, and it's one of the few reliefs that remains. Most of the records of Hatshepsut have actually been erased from the Egyptian record. Here's a picture of the two of them. Hatshepsut on the left, and she was a woman, but they made her into a pharaoh. And how do you deal with that? Because in Egyptian mythology, pharaoh has to be a man, and so of course they make her an honorary man. They put a fake beard on her, and they make her an honorary man. And then you have Tutmosis III on the right there, and he is this famous pharaoh, Tutmosis III. Now here's a picture of one of the reliefs of Hatshepsut. And as you can see, she has been chiseled off the wall. Tutmosis III had the record of Hatshepsut removed. I'm not sure if she was killed or when she died, but either way, when she was gone, he erased the record of this woman from the walls, from the history of Egypt. You can see this other relief here where you see in the center there is Hatshepsut, and she's literally chiseled off the walls. You can see the chisel marks, and there's on either side, the gods are, placing a crown on her or something. But she's chiseled off the walls there, and so this pharaoh Tutmosis III definitely had a problem with his mother-in-law, and he wanted to be the only pharaoh. Now, interestingly, and go back to this slide here. His son Amenhotep II was not in Egypt during the time of the Exodus. You remember that the 10th plague, the plagues came in order, one at a time, and every time God told Pharaoh surrender, and Pharaoh refused to surrender, and finally he got to the last plague, and the last plague was the death of the firstborn in Egypt. But it was the death of the firstborn in Egypt, and his son was not in Egypt at the time. Amenhotep II was in Syro-Palestine. He was actually engaged in a war in Syro-Palestine at the time, I believe putting down an uprising at the time of the Exodus. And the interesting thing is, when he returned in June 1450, and we have clear records on this. This is very clear in the archaeological record that when he returned, he went ballistic. He went crazy. He saw what had happened. Egypt was basically flattened by the 10 plagues, and he was furious. And his Pharaoh had died. His firstborn son, who was in Egypt, was dead. The country was flattened, and he was furious, and so he went through and he started. He sent his soldiers attacking some of Egypt itself, and put the heads of his victims on pikes and rode them on a boat up the Nile River to show his power. And can you imagine if the U.S. soldiers went to Iraq and returned and started waging war on the citizens of our own country, right? I mean, this was pretty intense. He was very mad about something, right? And his son was killed in that 10th plague, his firstborn son, and so his secondborn son, Tutmosis IV, became the next pharaoh. He was the second-born son of Amenhotep II, and we'll look at that more here in a second. So here's a picture of Tutmosis III. And we're just giving the background right now. Okay, we're just giving the background. Tutmosis III was the mightiest pharaoh who ever lived. This is the mightiest pharaoh in Egyptian history. Here's a picture of him, and you can see he's larger than life. In his hand is the entire of, I believe that's the Assyrian army, and he has them all by the scruff of the head. He has them all by the hair in this picture. And he is this great conqueror in the Egyptian record. Here's another picture of him. And he's larger than life, and he's defeating some military there, and there's one of his pillars. And here he is. Here we're going to look at some articles, and here's Time Magazine, and we're going to look at what it says about Tutmosis III. Now you look, and they have a chronology here. Here's a picture of the different pharaohs, and you'll see, just like I'm not making this up. Here's Hatshepsut. She's on the left there, and then right next to her is Tutmosis III. And you can't see it because the picture is not good enough, but it basically describes him as the mightiest pharaoh. And I'll show you something else. So here's a screenshot from Wikipedia, and I know, Wikipedia is not the best source, but they are convenient for some things that are pretty common knowledge and are easy to prove. And so you can go and look up the Tutmosis III site and check the references and see if it's actually true. But this is pretty common knowledge in Egyptology, and you'll see the part that I highlighted here. He created the largest empire Egypt had ever seen. So this is a mighty, mighty pharaoh, Tutmosis III, the largest empire Egypt had ever seen. And another highlight from that same Wikipedia page, talking about his military campaigns, says that he was sometimes called Egypt's greatest conqueror, or the Napoleon of Egypt. Okay, so here we have the mightiest conqueror of all the pharaohs, the Napoleon of Egypt, right? He set up a kingdom larger than any other pharaoh, and he's the writer of the Book of the Dead. Now think of this in your mind for a second here. This guy is the man. This is the Napoleon of Egypt. This is the most powerful pharaoh that ever lived, militarily, politically, and religiously. He's this religious figure, and do you think the God of the Bible would take a puny pharaoh to take on, to show his might? I mean, you think about this, and it fits. It fits the story. Why did this pharaoh not give in? And with plague after plague, and we read that, and we're just like, why was this guy so arrogant? Why would he not give in after the first plague and just say, okay, you're God and I'm not? Why didn't he not give in? It's because we're talking about Tutmosis III. And this guy, he thought he was God. He was the greatest conqueror of Egypt. He was the Napoleon of Egypt. He wrote the Book of the Dead. He was the man. And God says, look, I'm going to show this guy who God really is. And God doesn't take on a puny pharaoh. He takes on the Napoleon of Egypt. And this fits the story, I think. Okay, now, this is all interesting. But here's where the evidence starts to get a little intense here. Here you have a picture of Tutmosis III's mummy. Well, actually, this can't be his mummy. This was the mummy that was found in Tutmosis III's tomb, and some scientists by the name of Harrison Weeks, two scientists that were commissioned to study this Tutmosis III's tomb, they studied this and they said, wait a minute, yeah, this is the body that's put in his tomb, but this is a fake mummy. What's going on here? And they studied it, and they knew Tutmosis III at the time of his death was around the age of 80. These two scientists, they studied this, and they said, this man was about 80 when he died. But looking at this mummy is not of an 80-year-old man. This is a young man. And they can tell by the bones and so forth, hey, this guy was in his 20s, 30s, maybe 40s at the latest, but this is not an 80-year-old man. And so what we have in Tutmosis III's tomb is a fake mummy. And you can look this up. Harrison Weeks, they were the ones who studied this, and they showed it, and they said, hey, yeah, it's a fake mummy. Why is there a fake mummy? Why is there a fake mummy? Well, according to the Bible story, Pharaoh died where? In the Red Sea. And so there would be no body. But according to Egyptian religion, according to Egyptian mythology, you have to have the mummy because, Pharaoh lives on in the afterlife, and this is very important. And so their whole legitimacy as the ruling class was based on that religion. And you have to have the mummy. And so if there's no mummy, if the mummy's in the Red Sea, well, they got to make a fake mummy. And this was not uncommon. When Pharaoh died, not that there would be a fake mummy, but that people would be killed when Pharaoh died. When Pharaoh died, his entire staff, the servants, were all killed. Not the ruling class people, not the priests and so forth usually, but his servants would be all killed to serve him in the afterlife. So it's no big deal for them to whack another guy and say, this is the body of Tutmosis III, and put him as the fake mummy. So that's interesting. Why is there a fake mummy? Okay, here's another picture, and this is from Tutmosis III's tomb, and you see the priest throwing down the staff, and it becomes a serpent. Now, does that sound familiar? Yeah. In the Bible story, one of the first miracles that Moses showed Pharaoh was he cast his serpent down his staff down, and it became a serpent. And you see that in Tutmosis III's tomb. You might say, oh, well, coincidence? Maybe. Let's keep looking at the evidence. Okay. His next picture is of a sphinx in Egypt. And there is a plaque there in between the legs. And in Egyptian, so this is an interesting story on this plaque. It says that one day Tutmosis IV, who was the second-born son of Amenhotep II, Tutmosis IV was walking by, and the Sphinx called to him and said, "Hey, Tutmosis IV, come here. I got a proposition for you. I got a bunch of sand in between my legs, and I can't remove it myself. I'm one of the Egyptian gods, but I can't remove the sand between my legs, right?" And he says, "Look, I'll make a deal with you. If you remove the sand from in between my legs, I will make you the second-born, the next pharaoh, instead of the firstborn." And he removed the sand, and therefore he became the next pharaoh. Now, you could believe that. Personally, I think it's a made-up story. I think they were trying to cover up why the firstborn wasn't the next pharaoh. You see, in the Egyptian mythology, again, the way that they established their legitimacy as the ruling class was the pharaoh's firstborn was the reincarnation of Horus, and he was therefore the next pharaoh. And so you had the situation where the firstborn's dead. What do? We'll make the secondborn the pharaoh, but how do we explain that the secondborn's the pharaoh instead of the firstborn? And they came up with this story. And it's on the plaque. And you can believe that if you want. You can believe that the Sphinx told Tutmosis IV to remove the sand, and that's why he was the pharaoh. Or I think what you can believe that if you want, that's what happened, and I don't think anyone would. But this story does seem to fit the Bible story, that they would cover up the fact that the firstborn wasn't the pharaoh. It seems to fit that they have this kind of silly story that covers up why the firstborn wasn't the pharaoh. Okay. Now, after this, after the Exodus, right after the Exodus, we have a change in the religion of Egypt. It's called the Amarna period. And you can look this up, the Amarna period. It's a change in the religion. Right after the Exodus, a change in religion. Why? Right after the Exodus, a change in the religion in Egypt. And you had Amenhotep III. There's a shift during his reign from Amun worship, which is the worship of the goat god, to Atenism. And Atenism was a monotheistic religion. So before in Egypt you had pantheism, And now we have this shift toward monotheism. And you study the Amarna period and you see that it's not all black and white. You know, it's hard to take a nation who had been steeped in pantheism for hundreds of years and shift them over to monotheism like that. And so it's not exactly black and white like that, but there is this great shift in the religion of Egypt toward Atenism. And Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten. So no longer Amenhotep, Amun is pleased. Now we have Akhenaten. And Aten being a reference to Atenism. And so we change from Amun worship to Atenism. He was married, Akhenaten was married to the famous Nefertiti. You might have heard of her. He had 6 daughters, one of which was Ankhensenpaten. Aten. You see, everything ends in Aten. This is Atenism. And he married a young man by the name of Tutankhaten. But this young man, later in life, changed his name to Tutankhamun, the famous Tutankhamun. So basically what happened in the Amarna period is that there's a shift toward monotheism, a shift toward Atenism in the days of Akhenaten and Nefertiti and his 6 daughters. But then the guy who was supposed to take over, Tutankhaten, who married Akhenaten's daughter, Ankhensenpaten, this guy changed religions, went back to Amun worship, and Akhenaten and his entire family were murdered. So what happened was this guy who made this big shift in the religion of Egypt to monotheism, him and his entire family were murdered, except for Ankhensenpaten. So now here's this violent shift back toward Amun worship. And Tutankhamun, basically he sold out and went, and for power and for money, he sold out and went back to the worship of Amun. So monotheism in Egypt, Atenism. Here you have a picture of the one god of Atenism, giving the Ankh, which is a symbol of life in Egypt, to Akhenaten. And here you have a statue of Akhenaten, and realism comes to Egypt. If you notice the picture of this guy, the pharaohs before, they always made them look perfect. Everything about them looked perfect. They were larger than life. But this guy said, you know what? I don't look perfect. Don't make me look perfect. Make me as I am. And so you notice he has a little bit of a potbelly there, and he had them put that in his statue, and realism comes to Egypt. And this guy, there's a big debate over whether or not Aten was simply the Egyptian representation of the God of Moses, of the God of the Bible. And the reason why is Akhenaten wrote a poem to his God. And guess what? He quotes almost verbatim one of the Psalms of Moses. So whose God was he following? After the Exodus, we have this shift in religion toward monotheism, and the Pharaoh himself writes a poem to his God, and it's the same God as the God of Moses. I think this is pretty interesting stuff. So here's another picture of realism in Egypt, where, as I showed you before, in the time of Ramesses, you had the wife as Nehi, right? But now we have Akhenaten on the left, kissing his daughter, and his wife Nefertiti on the right, and they're the same size. And so it's no longer this, I'm larger than you type of dominant view that we have. Now realism comes, and you see his potbelly in the relief, in this relief, this Egyptian hieroglyphs. You see his potbelly there. Okay, let's summarize the evidence we've seen so far. A pharaoh dies the same day as the Exodus. like the Bible story says he would have died. The 17th of March, 1450 BC. He happens to be the mightiest pharaoh of all time. And in his tomb, there's a fake mummy. Why? Because there's no body. And there's a made-up story in the hieroglyphs as to why the second-born son takes over instead of the firstborn son. And the Bible story says because the firstborn son was killed in the 10th plague. And right after that, you have a change of religion in Egypt. Now, you can say, "Oh, this is circumstantial evidence. This is," and you know what? I would not say that this proves the story. I don't think that this proves the story, and I'm not claiming it does. And I don't expect anyone to believe the story just from this. But you got to admit, this is pretty remarkable evidence. This is pretty interesting, and it definitely supports the Bible story. But that's not all. We got more evidence. And this is where the evidence really starts to get ridiculous, and you really start to have to get very cynical to not believe the Bible account. Okay, let's look at the Red Sea crossing itself. Okay, so looking at the map here, we have on the left, kind of in the pinkish red, that's Egypt proper. And at the border of Egypt proper, you see is Succoth with that little red dot there. And you see the two forks of the Red Sea. The Red Sea comes from below and splits into two parts, and they join together there on the bottom. It's not in the picture. But and typically when this story is told, we're told that the Exodus took place, the crossing of the Red Sea took place on that left side, that left-hand side of the water there, of the two forks of the Red Sea. And near the top there, it's kind of shallow water, and it's not that far across. And the story is basically that, maybe it was an earthquake or, a low tide or something, and it wasn't that deep, and they just kind of waded through the water. And that's the story of the Exodus. And then it got exaggerated, to this whole story of God parting the waters. That's typically the story. And so according to that's the official story, at least that's told by most people. And according to the Bible story, after the Exodus, they go to Mount Sinai, and God comes down on the mountain and gives the Ten Commandments. Okay, so people following this traditional view that it was on this left-hand fork of the Red Sea look for Mount Sinai somewhere in the land that's in between those two forks. They look for Mount Sinai there. And indeed, in the time of Constantine, Constantine sent his mother to go find Mount Sinai, and she supposedly had a dream that either him or her supposedly had a dream that they found Mount Sinai, and they went, and sure enough, they found a mountain, and they declared it to be Mount Sinai. And it's all based on this person's dream, I just had a dream that was Mount Sinai. And today there's a monastery there, and it's called Mount Sinai on the maps. But that doesn't fit the Bible story at all. According to the Bible story, that day of the Exodus, they came out of Egypt proper, and Egypt proper is kind of that pinkish area on the map, and then they traveled through what is called the wilderness of the Red Sea, and you can see that on the map there. And then the Exodus, the Red Sea crossing happened. Okay? So the wilderness of the Red Sea is this landmass in between those two forks, and what happened was they kind of went down into the wilderness of the Red Sea, and they could have turned back up toward Etham, you see on the map there, and up north toward Palestine, toward Canaan. But instead of doing that, God directed them to turn to the right and go toward the Red Sea. And that right-hand side of the two forks of the Red Sea is called the Gulf of Aqaba. And so God directed them to go toward the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, what happened was they left Egypt, and Pharaoh sent his army after, and came himself actually, to attack and follow after them. He said, what am I doing? I just let go of my slave force. What was I thinking? I need to go after them and catch them. And again, this is the Napoleon of Egypt, and so he was probably very proud and was not going to give in to defeat. So he followed them, and they went into this particular path that God directed them to go toward. And you can see it on the map there. You see, I'll highlight it in yellow. You see that path? And on either side of that path was mountains. And these are very high mountains. These aren't easily crossed. And so when Pharaoh saw that they went into that path, the Bible story says that he said, the wilderness has shut them in. They've got no way out. I've got them. Because he knew once they entered that path, on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side were mountains. And all they could do was go forward, and they were at a dead end. It ended at the Gulf of Aqaba. And what are they going to do? They're stuck. They can't go forward into the water, right? And so he thought, as soon as I got them in that path, I'll cut them off from escaping back out of that path. I'll come from behind, and I've got them trapped. And so he followed after them with all the chariots of Egypt, it says. Here's a picture of that road, and you can see the road goes, and it looks like it's going to run straight into the mountain, and then the road turns. And it kind of winds through these mountains, and these are, you can see, these are not little mountains. And there's no way out to the right or to the left. It's just mountains. I could show you a lot of pictures of these mountains, but I'll just show you a couple here. And the end result is that. You see up in the distance at the end is the water. That's the Gulf of Aqaba. And you've got nowhere to go. On the right or to the left is mountains, and straight ahead is water. And there's a closer picture of it, the Gulf of Aqaba right there. And there's a large beach in the front. And that's where the Israelites they were kind of led into a trap there. Now here's another angle of the Gulf of Aqaba, and you can see kind of halfway up the length there's that, on the left-hand side, there's that white beach, that big white beach, and that's where the Israelites would have ended and stood at the edge of the water and said, what are we going to do? Because Pharaoh's right behind us. And here's another close-up picture of that beach. And remember, it had to be a really big beach because there was probably 2 or 3 million people. According to the biblical record, it was about 2 or 3 million Jews that came out of Egypt. And so it's got to be a big beach. And so here we do have a very big beach at the end of that path. And you can clearly see the path coming like right out of the mountains. There's this big beach. And there's an arrow there. And that's pointing to show that the mountains go right up to the edge of the water. So there was no way out. You couldn't go north. You couldn't go south to escape. And you couldn't go forward because there was the water. And you couldn't go back because Pharaoh was already in that path coming at you. So there's no way out. Here's another aerial view, and you can see that big beach at the end of that path there, and you see that this is not a very narrow place to cross the Red Sea. This is deep. This is wide, deep ocean, and I'll show you some more pictures as we go along. But the Gulf of Aqaba had another problem, more than just the fact that it was wide. And more than just the fact that there was water there. Even if you parted the water, the Gulf of Aqaba dropped off to almost a sheer, 90-degree angle cliff. And so even if the water wasn't there, the Jews would have to walk off a cliff in order to go across. And so you had another problem. Now this is where the evidence gets really interesting. Here's a picture of what and you can look this up. These are I believe these are British naval maps of the ocean. And here's what the topography of the ocean floor looks like. This is very interesting. Here you see that there is, right at the end of that beach, an underwater land bridge. You see that? Where it's not a sheer cliff. On either side, on to the right or to the left, there's almost a sheer cliff, and it's very deep, and you're just falling off a cliff there. But right where the crossing would have happened, there's this underwater land bridge. Now you say, oh, well, that means that it was easy to cross. They could have just waded across the water. No. It was a gentle slope. It was a very gentle slope. so they didn't fall off a cliff, but it was still deep in the middle. In the middle, we're talking about 100 feet deep. So, what's that, like 10 stories deep? That's not, you don't just wade through that, I mean, that's deep water. A regular pool, the deep end's like, what, 12 feet? We're talking 100 feet deep. This is 10-story building fits in the middle of that, but it's a gentle slope. Now, how interesting that they came and their route ends right at a place where if the water is parted, there's a gentle slope right there. You start to see the picture, and of course, God would have known that. Now, here's another picture of it, and you can see the topography where it's much shallower right there where the crossing took place, and it is there's an underwater land bridge there, but still about 100 feet deep in the center. Now, there was a gentleman by the name of Ron Wyatt, and I highly recommend his materials. You can watch his stuff on YouTube. He was an amateur archaeologist, and I like that. He was a small fry. He wasn't a big professional at some major university or something. He wasn't part of the intelligentsia, so to speak. This is an amateur archaeologist, but he looked at the biblical record, and he looked at the traditional interpretation. He said, you know what? This idea that Mount Sinai was in between the two forks of the Red Sea, that doesn't fit the biblical account. And so he looked and he said, you know what? It must have been, the crossing must have been the Gulf of Aqaba. And he found this path through the mountains, and he says that fits the Bible story perfectly. And he found the beach at the end, and he says this fits the Bible story perfectly. And here's this underwater land bridge. Let's go diving on this underwater land bridge and film what we find. And sure enough, you can go on YouTube and watch the footage for yourself, and you will watch this guy filming the evidence underneath the water. And you know what? Guess what he found? Well, the Bible says that the Hebrews, God parted the waters miraculously. The Hebrew slaves went across on dry land all the way across, and the Egyptian army, the conquerors came after their slaves, and they came marching right into that dry land where the water was parted, and that God let the water close back on them, and the entire Egyptian army was killed in the Red Sea, and Pharaoh died as well. The Bible says in Exodus chapter 14 verse 25 that the Lord took off their chariot wheels. So the Egyptians are traveling after the Hebrews, trying to capture them, and the Lord takes off their chariot wheels. So you would expect to find on the bottom of the Red Sea on this underwater land bridge a bunch of chariot wheels. Well, Ron Wyatt went diving there, and guess what he found? What does that look like to you? Can you see the spokes there? You see a hub in the middle and spokes on the outside? You may say, oh, well, that doesn't look clear enough. I'll show you some more. Here's a picture of this obviously is not underwater, but here's a picture of hieroglyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and some chariot wheels there. And you can tell by the number of spokes on the chariot wheels what era that this is talking about. Ron Wyatt, when he found these chariot wheels and he took his evidence back, pictures back to the Egyptologists in the area and asked them, hey, what era is this from? Immediately he was told the 18th dynasty, and he thought, well, that almost seems like too quick of an answer. How would you know so quickly that it's the 18th dynasty? And he was told that there was only one time in Egyptian history that both the 4-spoke, 6-spoke, and 8-spoke wheels were all used at the same time, and that was the 18th dynasty. So the Egyptologists knew very easily, hey, this had to be the 18th dynasty. And you can actually date monuments, Egyptian hieroglyphs, you can date them by how many spokes are on the wheels. Well, the wheels that Ron found were to the 18th dynasty, and guess what? That's the exact time of the Exodus. So this fits also. Here's another picture, and what you're seeing here is the coral that's grown on top of the, all the the sea crustaceans and so forth that has grown on top of what used to be the chariot wheels. I mean, this is wood. It's a couple thousand years old, and it's going to disintegrate, obviously, few thousand years old. But the coral that grows on top of it keeps this shape. So you can kind of see a wheel there. Let me make it a little bit more clear for you. Can you see it now? The spokes in the center. And go back here. And that should be pretty clear. Here's another picture of different chariot wheels. See, there's the 4 spoke on the bottom and the 8 spoke on the top. And you see it again, another representation of this. Now here's another chariot wheel that was found there that's very clear. And you can see the coral growing just in the center. Now how come this one isn't completely covered in coral? The reason why is that this is a gold-plated chariot wheel. So it's just gold plating. The wood on the inside is probably disintegrated. It's just this thin gold veneer. But the coral grows where where it was exposed. The wood was exposed, and so you just have the gold. The coral doesn't grow on the gold. Now let me ask you a question. Who would you expect to have a gold-plated chariot wheel? And Ron Wyatt found this near the back of on the western side of the Red Sea, so near the back of where the army would have been if they had all traveled in, and this would be near the back. Well, a gold-plated chariot wheel would obviously be someone very important, someone who would stay in the back while the foot soldiers are up front. So this could be perhaps a high priest, one of the Egyptian high priests, or perhaps even Pharaoh himself. Would have a gold-plated chariot wheel. And that definitely fits the biblical account. Here's a close-up of a gold-plated chariot wheel. Can you see that? That is obviously a chariot wheel on the bottom of the Red Sea, dating back to the 18th dynasty on this underwater land bridge. To me, these are too many coincidences. So I'd like to give you a verse from the Bible that I think a lot of you probably haven't heard, or maybe you haven't heard explained in a proper way. And this is Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. A lot of people think that the Bible demands that we have blind faith. And I don't think that's the case. When you read all these stories in the Old Testament, there was always evidence. When Moses was first commissioned by God to go and from the burning bush, and God told him, go and speak to the people and set them free, Moses' response was, I'm going to go to them and they're going to say, how do we know God spoke to you? And God said, well, here's some evidence. And he gave him a miracle, putting the staff on the ground and it would turn into a snake. And there was always some kind of evidence throughout the Bible of that God had actually sent these people. Jesus gave miracles, and I don't believe that those people are any more special than we are today. And if God gave miracles to them, then I think he would give evidence for us as well. So Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1 lays out a principle that I think is very important. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The evidence of things not seen. So see, it's not asking for blind faith. It's asking for us to base our faith on evidence of something that we haven't seen. Now, we do that all the time today. A lot of people, drive cars. Or at least if you don't have a car, maybe you get on a bus. You trust probably a car in some time in your life, unless you're Amish or something like that, right? You get in a car, and you trust it with your life, but how many of you have actually opened up the hood and gone into the details of seeing if all the intricacies of the brakes are actually there? How many of you have actually seen all the details of your brakes, or all the details of the pistons inside your car and so forth? How many of you have seen all those details, but yet you know that they are there? Why? You have evidence. You press down the brake and it stops. You have evidence that the brake is there, even if you haven't actually seen it. And so it's not blind faith. It's faith based on evidence. And I think that's what the Bible asks. In the same way you could say, how many people have been to Japan? or to some faraway land that we know exists, but we've never been there. We've never actually seen it physically with our eyes. It doesn't mean it does not exist. You have evidence. Now, you could be very cynical, and you could say, well, maybe all these people, all these pictures of Japan are all just made up. And everyone who says they've been there, it's all just a big conspiracy to trick me. But I think that would be an unreasonable doubt. And so what the Bible does is it gives us evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think as we start to pile the evidence along and you look at the weight of evidence, not just one thing, then you can make a rational decision. And so what I've presented today, I think, is evidence, but I don't claim that this is enough evidence to convince the most hard-nosed skeptic that the Bible is 100% true. But I do think that this is enough evidence to make you pay attention. I do think that there is enough here that we have to say this is beyond mere chance coincidence. There might be something more here. Maybe I should at least look at more evidence. And that's all I'm asking. I'm not saying you need to, because of this presentation, you need to believe the Bible 100%. Maybe there's some people who this is enough, and that's enough for them, and that's enough proof. But I think for some people out there, this would not be enough, and I think that's reasonable, that you want to see more evidence. But I think that this is enough that you should look at more evidence. So let me summarize one more time. In summary, we have seen that there is a Pharaoh who dies on the same day as the Exodus, Tutmosis III. He's the mightiest Pharaoh of all time. In his tomb, there's a fake mummy, just as the Bible says there would be, because the body would be in the Red Sea. There's a made-up story as to why the second-born takes over the throne instead of the firstborn. Because of the 10th plague, the firstborn was dead. And there's a change in the religion of Egypt right after this time period that switches largely to monotheism instead of pantheism. And there's an underwater land bridge right at the route that the Exodus would have taken place that's got a bunch of chariot wheels from the 18th dynasty on it. To me, this is too much coincidental evidence, quote unquote coincidental. I think this to me is pretty good evidence that perhaps the Bible story of the Exodus actually is true. And it's my prayer that you would consider this and look into more evidence. Thank you.